Thanks so much. Ham, thanks so much for that really nice introduction. I know you got a lot of great speakers at EA, and I know they come and talk about really exciting topics. I'm afraid mine's not that exciting. I'm hoping that you can make it a little bit more exciting when we get to a Q&A, and you can ask anything that you'd like about what I do and what it is to be a CEO or what's going on in our nation's economy. The subject I'm going to talk about is not all that exciting, but I think it is important. And one sign of how important housing and housing finance is that it is nearly impossible to pick up the newspaper and not read an article about the housing crisis, mortgage problems, what's going on in the industry. It's been true for about 3 years that every time I pick up the paper, Wall Street Journal, Philadelphia Inquirer, doesn't matter what the paper is, there's a front page article. And today was no exception. Today I picked up the Wall Street Journal early, and the lead story talks about housing prices going down yet again at the end of 2010. A real serious problem that our country faces. And I want to spend a few minutes with you today talking about how we got there and how we might work out of this problem in terms of housing. So let me talk about how we got here. It turns out that our country, our federal government, for 60 or 70 years has thought it would be a very, very good thing to have as many people as possible own their own home, own rather than rent. That's been an official policy of our government coming out of World War II. Great things if people would own and buy their own home, not just rent. Why would they think that? Why would that seem to be a good government policy? Well, people thought that if people owned a home, it would lead to a more stable community, that people would invest more, be more committed to their neighborhood. We'd have cleaner neighborhoods, we'd have better schools, we'd have less crime. People associated all those good forms of stability with home ownership. I think that makes some sense. And in fact, the government adopted policies to encourage people to own their own homes. Tax policy in our country was shaped around the notion of being better to own a home. And so if you borrow to buy a home, the interest on that is tax deductible. Your real estate taxes are tax deductible. If you sell your home, the gain on the gain that you made, that is the capital gain, gets special tax treatment. So lots of tax policy favored home ownership. In addition to that, the federal government created two companies that are interchangeable. Everybody gets them confused. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and those two companies were designed to make sure that there was lots of mortgage money available, that is, lots of money so that people could borrow to buy a home, and that the interest rates on those borrowings would be very low. So we had tax policy and we had mortgage availability, all designed around the notion of trying to get as many people as possible to buy their own homes. And none of the benefits that I just talked about were available to renters. So not surprisingly, lots of people, when trying to decide what to do, were pushed in the notion of home ownership because of those advantages. And there were many, many good things that came out of this 60 or 70 year government policy favoring home ownership. Many good things happened. We got our home ownership rate up to 69%. That is, of all the families in the country, 69% came to own their own home. It was a successful policy. Another good thing that came out of this policy was that housing prices went up. Housing prices went up, in fact, for 70 consecutive years in our country. Every single year for 70 years, housing prices went up, a good thing. Because this allowed people to accumulate wealth. They would buy a house, it would go up in value, they'd pay down their debt, and when they got older and got to retirement age, they had some savings in the form of their house, which they could then sell. They could sell their house, take their savings, and live off it for the rest of their lives. So there was a lot of good things that came out of this government policy. Unfortunately, there were some bad things that came out of this government policy. And one of them was that prices went up 70 years in a row. That sounds like a good thing, except if you're a young family, just getting married, starting out, and you can't afford to buy a house because prices are too high. That's a bad thing. A second bad thing that came out of this policy that actually policymakers, I don't think, fully understood at the time they adopted this policy was that our labor force would be far less mobile because of a high home ownership rate. Which is to say that if you are a renter, one of the good things about renting is that if in your area, say Detroit, there is not good employment and you rent, you can easily move yourself and your family to another area where there is a job. And one of the struggles we're having in our country right now is we have a very high unemployment rate. Lots of people looking for jobs, but also lots of people can only look for a job in a very narrow geographic area because they have this home that they're unable to sell. So far, two bad things have come out of this policy that I talked about. One, young families can't afford a home, and secondly, the labor force can't move around very much because of home ownership. A third thing happened, and that is if we have tax policy favoring home ownership, if we have available credit so that you can borrow, and you see prices go up for 70 consecutive years in a row, you know what's going to happen? What's going to happen is people are going to put lots and lots of their savings and investment into houses. Tax advantages, available credit, prices going up, people put lots of money in their houses. What's wrong with that? Well, we get too much housing. And what are examples of too much housing? Houses that are too big. Some of you have heard of the phrase McMansion. Lots of bedrooms, lots of bathrooms, media rooms, giant houses. During the course of the 60 or 70 years, houses have probably gone up in square footage by 50 to 70%, all because of this policy. Second thing that you can do if you want to participate in this ever-increasing pricing of houses is you can get a second home. Vacation homes become very, very popular because of tax advantages, ever-increasing prices. And a third thing is lots of people became investors in houses, not just living and owning in one house, but owning 3 or 4 houses and trying to rent them out. In summary, because of the government policy, we got too much housing. It was a byproduct of what started out as a very, very good policy. So far, everything I've talked about seems sort of reasonable, no bad acting. We've got the government trying to do some good things. Maybe there have been some secondary factors, some byproducts that came along that were a little negative. But the story gets worse because there actually was some bad actors that entered into the scene now. And these people entered in because pricing in houses went up for 70 consecutive years. And some of that, those bad actors were consumers and individual families, and some of it was the industry such as what I represent, that is lenders and builders and real estate agents. And let me talk a little bit about some of that bad acting, and it's largely around the notion of greed. If you're a homeowner, if you're a family, if you're a regular person, and you've seen an asset go up for 70 consecutive years, never going down, you want as much of that as you can. And that's what homeowners did. They bought big houses and they bought lots of houses. And they decided that they could get rich by putting more and more money into houses. They got a little bit greedy. But also the lenders, and that would be my community, the banks, Fannie and Freddie, got a little bit greedy because they had seen the housing prices go up for 70 consecutive years, and they thought it was really easy to lend the money out and get it back. Because even if the family couldn't pay the mortgage back, you still had that asset, that house that went up in value every single year. And so the lenders, the banks, and people like Freddie and Fannie started to lend money with zero down payment, nothing down. Traditionally, if you bought a $500,000 house, you have to put $100,000 down and you borrow $400,000, a 20% down payment. That's how it was for years and years and years. But in the boom period, some lenders said, we don't need anything down. You can buy a house with 0 down. You don't even have to prove to us that you have a job. That was part of the greed in the system. And then it actually got a little bit worse because so many people were benefiting from the housing market and prices going up that they started to make campaign contributions to those congressmen that would benefit housing. And they started to spend lots of money on lobbying of folks so that we would have a better situation for housing. So real estate agents, builders, unions that represent carpenters and plumbers, Fannie and Freddie, banks, all started lobbying Congress to get better and better treatment for the housing industry, which just made the problem worse. All of this, that is the government policy, which was generally a good thing, but then led to some bad actions by people. All of that together caused us to have much more housing than this country needs or wants. You go to the mall and you go to a retail store and they have too many t-shirts in inventory. You know what they do. You got too much of something, you just lower the price until you find some way you can sell all this stuff. And that's exactly what's going on in our housing industry today. We've got too much stuff. We've got too much houses. So the natural thing is happening. Housing prices have come down. So even though for 70 years, housing prices went up continuously every single year, never down, in the last 4 years, housing prices have gone down by 30%. And as the Wall Street Journal article indicated today, they're still going down. Down 30%. So think about how bad that is. If you, again, taking that hypothetical $500,000 house, if you own that house that used to be worth $500,000 is now worth $350,000. If you had paid all cash for that house, that is, if you had paid $500,000 cash with no borrowing, and it went down to $350,000, that'd be pretty bad. But not a disaster. You could still live in the house, still raise your family there, still go to the same schools. Not a disaster. Where the disaster comes in is the following. It goes back to that original transaction. Almost nobody can buy a house for all cash. They've got to borrow lots of it. The typical arrangement is you put 20% down. So on that $500,000, you put $100,000 cash down and you borrow $400,000. What happens if that house price goes down by 30%? The house price is now worth $350,000. What do you owe? $400,000. That's a disaster. That is really troubling people. And one of the issues that our country faces is what we're going to do about those people whose house is worth less than what they owe. In our industry, we call that being underwater. And one of the ethical issues that lots of people are facing is, what do they do when they're in that situation? Do they walk away from that mortgage? Do they send the keys back to the lender and say, you take care of it? Or do they follow through on an obligation that they have, which was when they took out the loan, they agreed to pay it back? I'm not sure what the answer is. But think about the economics for that family that used to have a $500,000 house, a $400,000 mortgage, and a net worth or a balance sheet of plus $100,000. Today what they have, they got a house that's worth $350,000, they owe $400,000, and their net worth is minus $50,000. They went from plus $100,000 to minus $50,000 in just 3 or 4 years. I've talked about this problem in terms of the sort of micro level, that is family by family, one house, one $500,000 house. Let's look at the overall state of the housing market. Most importantly, housing prices are down 30% nationwide. and they haven't stopped yet going down. My estimation is that sometime late in the year, we will have a stabilization in prices, but we haven't reached there yet. Because of high unemployment in this country, and because people bought very, very expensive houses, many, many families are in trouble with the debt that they owe. In fact, we have 55 million mortgages in our country, 55 million families that owe debt on their house, and about 10% of them are 3 months behind in their payment. About 5 to 5.5 million families have not paid their mortgage payment for 3 months. The significance of that is they are very close to losing their home, and certainly are incredibly worried about that. 5 million families are on the brink of losing their home. Think what that means in terms of the disruption to the family and the normal cycle of the family, where they go to school, where they shop, how they live, having to find some alternative place to live, maybe with a family member, maybe in a shelter. An unbelievable statistic. 9 to 10% or 9 to 10% of all people who have mortgages are 90 days delinquent. That statistic is usually less than 1% in our country, and it's 9 to 10% now. And with regard to that mathematics that I went through that talked about underwater, that is people whose debt is more than their home value, that's 25% of all the mortgages. That's about 13 million people trying to figure out whether the best thing to do is walk away from their mortgage. So it's not a very pretty picture. Why does it matter? Why does the state of our housing market get such constant coverage in our newspapers? Why do so many people focus on housing in our country? It's because it has such incredible ramifications on our overall economy and overall well-being. Let me cite a couple examples of how troubling the housing market is for the rest of the company. One is the personal tragedy that I've already alluded to. 5 million families, which probably is 15 or 20 million people, are on the brink of having to leave their house. 15 or 20 million people. Huge part of our population. Think of the personal tragedy there. But it goes beyond there. If we've got all these houses on the market that aren't selling, we have people who are losing their homes, and therefore those homes go on the market. We've got giant excess supply of houses in our country. What do you think that does for new home construction? How many new homes are going to be constructed given the fact that we have such a huge supply? Not many. And in fact, last year, the number of new homes that were constructed was a number like 350,000. In a good year, it used to be 2.1 million. So the amount of home construction in our country is down about 80%. 2.1 down to 350,000. Think what that means if your job is being a roofer, a plumber, a carpenter, electrician. You're out of work and there are not much prospects. It's going to be a long time before we can get home construction back to where it used to be. Think of the impact of that decline in housing starts on unemployment. Third impact of this housing crisis on the overall economy goes to that family that I talked about whose net worth went from plus 100,000 to minus 50. Remember that analysis? House price goes down 30%, debt stays the same, your savings, your net worth goes from 100,000 positive to minus 50,000. What do you think that does to your interest in spending money, going out to dinner, buying clothes, buying a car? You essentially stop. And that's what's happened in our economy and why our economy has been weak. And a fourth impact of housing on the overall society is one that troubles me a lot, and that is it adds to an already big problem we have, which is the widening gap between the rich and the poor. For most Americans, like 90 to 95% of them, all of their wealth, all of their saving is in their house. And they've just lost 30% of it. The top 1% has lots of stocks, lots of bonds, lots of savings in bank accounts. Yeah, they got a house, but they got lots of other stuff. And they've lost some in their house, but all that other stuff is doing fine. Those families where everything is bad in the house have had a major disruption, and as a result, the gap between that top 1% and everybody else in our society has gotten much wider and much worse. So I'd argue, even though this issue of the housing crisis and mortgage finance is not exciting, it is incredibly important. Let me close by talking for just a minute about some of the things that we're doing at Freddie Mac to try and help a little bit. And actually, I have to admit that the things on my list are not all that powerful. They're not all that big a deal. But I think they're helping a little bit. So one of the things we're doing, as much as we can, is to try to keep people in their homes and avoid taking their home away from them if all possible. And the way we do that is if somebody loses their job, we say, for the next 6 or 9 months, you don't have to make a mortgage payment. Wait till you get your job back. Wait till you get on your feet. And then we'll resume the mortgage payment. For people who have a job, we've gone to them and tried to reduce their monthly payment by lowering their interest rate. An interest rate that might have been 6 or 7%, we've taken it down to 2%. The payback period traditionally for one of these mortgages is 30 years. You pay your loan over 30 years. We've gone to many people and say, let's extend the term to 40 years so that the monthly payment will be lower and you'll be able to stay in your home. So we've tried to do what we can to keep people in their homes, but it is a struggle. And we still have to foreclose sometimes. We still have to go to some family. Imagine this for your job. Your job is to go and take a house away from a family because they can't afford to stay in it. It's not a pleasant thing to do. We do it a fair amount. Actually, Freddie Mac owns about 100,000 houses around the country. When we do have to do that, we go in and we fix the property up. We take care of the property so that it's not a blight on the neighborhood. We try and sell it as fast as we can. Try and sell it to somebody who's going to live in the house, not an investor. And we try as much as we can to do it at a fair price, a price that's not a giveaway price, so that we don't push down housing prices. That's the limit of what we can do. It's not going to solve the problem. How are we going to solve the problem? The number one way that this problem is going to be solved is by jobs. And that's why in the past several months and in the State of the Union message, President Obama talked so much about jobs. We are not going to solve the underlying housing crisis unless we do something about jobs. Unemployment stated in our country is today 9.5%, but that way understates the problem. It doesn't include people who used to be looking for a job, weren't able to find one, and gave up, and are just not looking for a job. It also doesn't include those people who work part-time but want a full-time job. Part-time is not a very satisfactory way to work. Typically you don't get health benefits. It's not the optimal way to do it. If you add together stated unemployment, plus those who have given up looking, plus those who only have part-time work, the unemployment rate in our country is 17%. Obviously, in some segments of our community, it is way larger than that. We're not going to solve that housing problem unless people get back to work. Second thing we've got to do, if we're ever going to fix this, is that we've got to work through this foreclosure problem, this issue of people losing their homes and reselling them to somebody else. It is a big depressant on housing prices. It's why housing prices are still going down. And unfortunately, it's going to be a long time before we can solve that problem. It's just going to take time. It's going to take new family formations, which are about 1 million a year. It's going to take a number of years of that to work through our inventory before we can make some progress. So as we look forward, we think housing prices still have further to go down. Later this year may stabilize, but it's going to be a very, very long time before we see an increase in housing prices. And we've all got to be prepared for a long, slow climb out of this problem. I think with that, I will stop and see if anybody has any questions or things that they'd like me to talk more about.